All right, welcome everyone. So the exams are getting graded, and you will hopefully know by the end of today or tomorrow, certainly before drop date. So I hope you found the exam to be fair. I think nearly everyone is now done taking the exam, so you can talk about it to your peers, and you can even post about it on Piazza. But hopefully not so much information was revealed before. So today we're going to be talking about electronic health records, and in particular, how do we deal with population scale information about patients, basically beyond just one trait at a time? How do we deal with multiple phenotypes? And we're going to introduce the concept of PheWAS, the same way that GWAS was basically looking at genome-wide association studies that was basically centered on what is a given variant doing across the genome. What PheWAS is doing is basically asking, how is a particular phenotype correlated with tons of other phenotypes? And then the idea is that when you're dealing with one phenotype at a time, that's all you got. And you got to do multiple tests on the genetic side because you have multiple genetic variants that are correlated with that phenotype, potentially providing spurious correlations. When you're dealing with PheWAS, what you're doing is you're looking at the multiple groups of phenotypes that are varying together. For example, cholesterol, obesity, diabetes. They're a group of very highly correlated phenotypes. So treating any one of them in isolation only gives you part of the biology, whereas treating all of them together gives you a much more complete view. And in general, what I want you guys to start thinking about is sort of this phenotype-genotype matrix, which is basically asking what are the molecular phenotypes and how are they organized into modules? And what are the observable patient-level phenotypes and how are they organized into modules? And basically where we're heading with all this, and I think the point that I hope you're getting from the whole class, is this whole unification of biology, this ability to understand biology systematically, not just one gene at a time, but across all modules and all genes and all networks, not just one phenotype at a time, but across all phenotypes and modules and networks. Does that make sense? So I think that's sort of where we're heading with this concept of we're not dealing with single trait anymore. We're not dealing with combinations of traits. We're not dealing with single cohort anymore. We're now dealing with entire healthcare records of healthcare systems and so on and so forth. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Basically, how do we model electronic health records? How do we model many phenotypes together and their correlations? And sort of how do we deal with the various measurements that are available for any one person and sort of particularities of electronic health records, such as non-missing at random, that you should be very well aware of. There's another aspect of medical records, which is extraordinarily important, which is that there's interventions. There's two types of interventions. One type of intervention is the measurement itself. The fact that there was a measurement for my blood lipids indicates something about the expectation of the doctor for my blood lipids. They're not going to order a test just by chance. They're going to order it because they expect the result to be abnormal. Does that make sense? And therefore, the observed variables are going to be sampled from a different distribution, from an abnormal distribution, than the unobserved variables. Does that make sense? So basically, when I observe something, thanks so much. When I observe something, it is much more likely to be sampled from the abnormal distribution. And when I don't observe something, it's actually much more likely to be sampled from the normal distribution. Everybody with me here? So if I start ordering random tests, that distribution is going to look different from the test that I ordered because I care about the patients. Everybody with me here? There's another type of intervention, which is, of course, the treatment. And we're going to talk about how treatments that are based on biomarkers effectively obviate the predictive power that biomarkers had on outcome. So if a biomarker is predictive of increased risk, then of course the medical system is going to use it to decide an intervention. But then what used to be predictive of increased risk is now predictive of treatment, which is itself predictive of decreased risk. Everybody with me here? So basically, if you naively study medical records, you're going to find a lot of this reverse causality because of these interventions. Okay, so these are some of the key points that we're going to look at in the beginning of the lecture. And then we're going to switch to not just data in tables for clinical records, but also text. So we're going to see how these extraordinarily powerful models that we've seen for proteins, for genomes, for chemistry, apply to language. So we're going to revisit transformers briefly and now see how they apply to language in particular. And for language and medical records in particular, I'm going to walk you through a series of developments that led to the modern day understanding of how natural language processing, or NLP, applies to data. And then I'm going to show you some of our own work on modeling text and data jointly through multimodal embeddings that capture both language and structured data. Okay. Then we're going to switch to action, where basically we are now thinking not just of large language models that are sort of sitting there and predicting the next word, but actually thinking like agents. And we're going to introduce the concept of reinforcement learning, which is extraordinarily important as you start thinking about clinical decision-making and introducing AI in a doctor setting, where the doctor wants to predict what is the best next action that, we should take for a patient. And that will take us to a real-world application for how do we use AI agents in the context of value-based healthcare. Everybody with me here? And what is value-based healthcare? Value-based healthcare basically says, let's align the objectives. Instead of thinking of healthcare as I go to the doctor and then they decide what treatment I should get, we should instead start flipping around the objectives, where the objective is not going to be, the insurance company is kind of working against me to basically make sure that I don't overcharge them, or the healthcare system earns its money from the number of operations that they do. And therefore they have an incentive to carry out a test, even though it's very expensive, as long as the insurance will decide to pay for it. So basically the customer is there in the middle of a bunch of contrasting and sometimes conflicting objectives, where of course all of the doctors mean well, but the incentives are such that the healthcare system overall sees the patient as a small player in a lot of other cogs. So basically the idea is, can you flip this around and start thinking about value-based care, where you take on the responsibility of better health outcomes for a person, and then you decide what tests to run. Your goal is to minimize costs. Your goal is to maximize the overall health of a person. And therefore you can change the incentives to better align. Everybody with me here? Everybody excited? Yeah, awesome. All right, so where do we stand? We are here, basically. We've completed modules 1, 2, 3 on genomes, epigenomes, protein structure, chemistry, therapeutics, and now we're entering the world of electronic health records, imaging, evolution, metabolism, and you've completed all of your homework, you've completed your quiz, and the last part now is your mid-course report, your write-up in your slides, and eventually your class presentations, okay? How's everybody doing on their projects? Yes? So now that we have no more homeworks, now that all of this material is not going to be tested on anymore, I hope you guys sort of spend all that extra energy into wrapping up your projects, okay? And again, we're here to help. All right, so how do we deal with population-scale electronic health records? And, how do we integrate all that? So basically, why do we need to deal with multiple phenotypes? The idea is that when you have a comprehensive phenotypic data, along with genetic variation, instead of just doing each association in isolation, you start now learning about cross-phenotype associations. You're able to discover new insights. You're able to learn networks and the genetic architecture of complex traits, which has implication on drug discovery and pleiotropy. So the idea is, can we now associate either unknown or underappreciated phenotypes with known phenotypes? Can we identify disease mechanisms by understanding the mediation of those phenotypes? Can we start predicting disease using easier to measure biomarker phenotypes? Can we improve the power of genome-wide association studies by imputing missing phenotypes when these were not measured, but surrogate phenotypes were measured. So for example, in the UK Biobank, there's a distribution of ages that is such that you probably wouldn't be able to do anything with Alzheimer's disease because it hasn't yet manifested. But what you can do is ask, do you have any relatives with Alzheimer's? And suddenly having a relative with Alzheimer's is sufficiently powered that it can basically give you one of the most well-powered genome-wide associations for the actual genetic variants with Alzheimer's, because each of these people will only be off by 50%. Because they're, sharing 50% of their variants with their relative, for example, their parent or their sibling or, someone who has Alzheimer's. Everybody with me here? Awesome. So you can improve GWAS biological relevance by understanding perhaps not a single measurement, but instead a combination of measurements that might be more indicative of the true underlying biology. For example, my blood pressure might show something, and the fraction of, thrombocytes in my blood might show something else. But together, they might be indicative of yet another phenotype that is much harder to measure by any one of those, but together you're able to sort of capture that. So that's the idea of meta-phenotypes. Can you now understand through these networks of multiple traits, variables that are then perhaps even more strongly associated with the biology, and perhaps might even show stronger association with the genetics. So, for example, the Psychiatric Genome Consortium, or PGC, has basically now looked at not just schizophrenia in isolation, not just bipolar in isolation, but latent phenotypes that are psychiatric, that are associated with a common component of schizophrenia and bipolar. And those actually reveal new genetic variants that were previously not seen when you're looking at either one in isolation. So you can now start building a tree of phenotypic relatedness and relationships, and then start using that for your genetic associations. You can understand those pleiotropic effects affecting multiple phenotypes, and you can guide experiments and diagnosis by predicting the missing phenotypes and then going and measuring them, because you now have that ability to do prediction. And ultimately, you can enable personalized medicine by treating combinations of symptoms. So when we start thinking about electronic health records, you basically have different patients being entered into the system, and then you basically carry out some measurements. You do some lab tests. You can do some imaging or prescribe some drugs and write notes. So the electronic health record databases have some combinations of these. And some of them are given at point of care. Some of them are just statistics that, you measure. Some of them are used for research and, can kind of feedback. And you also have the longitudinal component of a patient over time. So this is extremely rich information. You also have unstructured free-form text. You have lab tests, which are, again, logical observations, where you have identifiers, names, codes. You have billing codes. So every time we talk about ICD-9 codes, they're not diagnostic codes. They're actually billing codes. They're basically what's being used to decide what you're going to be charged for. And unfortunately, doctors will sometimes have specific guidelines of what code they should be using because of the insurance system or because of the payer system, rather than as a way to best capture the true phenotype of the patient. So what you end up with is sometimes manipulation almost of the clinical record because of whatever the patient was billed for. They're like, well, I'm not going to bill you for this. I can bill you for that. And then, that will be reimbursed in a different way. So you end up with these systematic misclassifications of diagnosis. And, there's both classification of disease as well as procedural terminology and diagnosis-related groups or DRGs. And then you also have prescription data. Everybody with me so far? And again, these have been extraordinarily rapidly adopted. You now have electronic health records nearly everywhere, and they're becoming more and more comprehensive, okay? So then the question is there a bias in the actual ascertainment of the patient phenotype? And you have some true patient state, which basically represents something about the healthcare process And then you have some raw electronic health record data, which ultimately are associated with the true phenotype of the patient. But now the healthcare process informs both the phenotyping and the results of that phenotyping. Okay? So basically that's where, ultimately the knowledge comes of being able to classify, to predict, to understand, to intervene. Everybody with me here? There's many influences of this raw EHR data. It's only an indirect reflection of the true patient state because of both the recording process and because of the ascertainment bias on whatever tests and prescriptions I'm willing to do. And that patient state influences both the value of the measurement and whether the measurement is there at all, and also the type of measurement and the timing of measurement, etc. I can predict perfectly if a patient has diabetes by looking at the clinical record. Just look at what drugs they're taking, right? Because they wouldn't be prescribed a diabetes drug if they didn't have diabetes. Is everybody with me here? So basically just simply saying, oh, I have an AI algorithm that can predict diabetes, you have to sort of start thinking about that circularity. Everybody with me here? So basically there's many ways to sort of say, oh, I'm using the world's greatest machine learning for electronic health records. But in fact, you should be very cautious about, what that actually means. Okay. So how do we model all that? How do we sort of understand these meta phenotypes and their relationships? Okay. So the key idea is that what we want is to observe observational variables at this point. These are not causal variables from the genetics. These are observational variables from the electronic health record and the patient phenotype. And you want to understand how are these correlated with ultimately the disease outcomes. And can I use genetics to start predicting these mediating phenotypes? And very often you'll hear about causality inference. And we talked about this a little bit in the context of expression quantitative trait loci, the concept of mediation, where we basically said how much of the heritability of a disease, for example, is captured by genetics, and how much does the ultimate phenotype manifestation of this genetic variant is mediated through the intermediate phenotype, which could be expression, or it could be lipid measurements, and so on and so forth, okay? And what we said at the time is that this concept of Mendelian randomization is basically what allows you to say, if I know that genetically this particular variant is influencing the expression of this gene or the value of that lipid measurement, then I can think of this Mendelian randomization as a randomized interventional control trial, which basically says I'm going to assign the genotypic variables by chance at the beginning. And based on that assignment, I will ask, what is the correlated intermediate phenotype? For example, gene expression or methylation or lipids and so on and so forth. So now it's as if I was doing an interventional study on the lipids by effectively flipping the state of the genetic variable and then using that to say, what is the impact of that intervention on the phenotype, understanding this randomization effect, because not every interventional randomized control study is ethical, practical, and so on and so forth, okay? So then you can use Mendelian randomization that way by basically saying how much of the effect on the genotype is mediated through the intermediate molecular phenotype. And we also talked about this conditional analysis, where I can basically say, conditional upon observing the intermediate, say, lipid variable, is the genotype still predictive of the phenotype? And then conversely, conditional upon observing the phenotype variable, is the genotype predictive of the lipid measurement? If when I condition on the phenotype, the genotype no longer predicts the lipid measurement, that means that this was reverse causation coming from the disease. If conditioning on the lipids, there's no more an effect on the phenotype between genetics and phenotype, that means that the effect of genetics on phenotype was mediated through the intermediate lipid variable. Everybody with me here? Awesome. So now we can basically ask, okay, can we train a model that incorporates all of that information together? So the lab tests, the prescriptions, the diagnosis, the treatment, etc. And that understands not just as a patient state, but also that the patient state influences the clinical recommendations for that doctor. So this is basically work that my postdoc, Yue Li, who's now a professor at McGill, and I did on clinical records from both the Mayo Clinic and the MIMIC database. And we basically were able to now start modeling clusters of phenotypes, not just each phenotype in isolation, but start understanding the network of relationships between different phenotypes. And then you can visualize this using colors, or you can visualize using these word clouds that basically tell you for all of the phenotypes that are sort of linked together in each part of the network, what are the words associated with that. And you can see that a lot of this, makes a lot of sense. So basically you have, a group here associated with newborn, fetus, birth, perinatal, pregnancy, etc. You have another one with abnormal, congenital, and all of these are, of course, early stage. Then you have, anemias, blood, hemolytic, you have tuberculosis, infection, infectious, etc. You have cerebral, intracranial, nerve, nervous, meningitis. So you can now see that these phenotypes don't occur in isolation. These phenotypes occur in combinations with each other. Everybody with me here? And I promised you I was going to give you a little demo of, let's see, mimic. So basically, in today's world, we can now start looking at the same mimic data set, but now in a completely different way. And I can show you some of that. So I showed you a little glimpse of this tool we've developed called Mantis that basically allows you to directly visualize these latent embedding spaces. And this is now Mantis applied to the mimic dataset. So you can basically start seeing here how in every dot is a patient, and the description of that patient state is basically now projected in some latent embedding space. And I can basically, for example, scroll through and select groups of patients that have similar phenotypes. So for example, here I clicked on secondary malignancy cases, and I now have a group of patients. What's really nice about this is that, by doing this, I've created this, group called secondary malignancy that has 24 patients in it. I can do the same thing by, scrolling down and clicking on non-rupture cerebral aneurysm. And you can kind of see that, this selects another group of patients here. And I can now use the power of AI in combination with this visual selection of groups of patients to say, how are patients with non-ruptured, different from, let's say, secondary malignancy cases. Okay. And what's really exciting here? What's exciting is that you can now start asking questions in a visual way. You can basically say, how is this group of patients different from that group of patients? And you can ask the AI directly. You can basically, ask questions about, about these groups. You can also visually select on this group patients with, particular traits. For example, you can create these bags here and you can extend them. You can also search for, I don't know, aneurysm. And you can find all of the patients that have, aneurysm selected, or let's say depressive disorders. And, this allows us to now start using effectively this retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, that AI systems, that allows AI systems to be much more grounded on actual data in this visual way. But just by understanding these relationships between these different disorders, I can now start, creating something similar to what I have here based on these latent representations of these patients. And we can do this using clinical records, using information about the genes, using knowledge graphs, and also just using simply language, using large language models and their latent embeddings, as we're going to see, when we start talking about NLP in this lecture. Everybody with me so far? So that allows you to now start understanding which disorders are related to each other, which patients are grouped near each other, and sort of how can we understand not just individual traits, but also individual patients associated with these combinations of traits. Okay? So now you can start factorizing these multiple phenotypes to basically start reducing that representation. And instead of saying, okay, I have type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, et cetera, and each of them is an independent phenotype, you can basically start saying, if I factorize this matrix, can I discover eigen patients and also eigen phenotypes? In other words, groups of patients that are similarly behaving and groups of phenotypes that are co-occurring. And that allows us to now start simplifying this matrix into a much more interpretable set. You can basically start saying across the latent disease topics and across the latent patient clusters and along the latent EHR features, can I now start discovering themes and start modeling them as a generative probabilistic model, which basically samples a cluster and then from that cluster samples patients, and you have some additional variables that are influencing these phenotype distributions associated with each cluster, and so on and so forth. Everybody with me here? So what you can do now is basically start asking, how does that relate with language? So, with language, latent Dirichlet allocation was basically used to discover topics that are sometimes overlapping on the same document. And, some of those topics could be arts or budgets or children or education. And then using that, you can kind of infer what every document is about. So you can do the same thing here. You can basically say, can I discover groups of traits that are reflected in the blood tests that I have taken, or in the clinical notes, or in the prescriptions, or in the, ICD-9 codes, or in the DRG codes. And the problem is that, the data is very noisy by itself. So basically, every one of those variables might be present or not, or not. It might be, sometimes using an acronym, sometimes using abbreviations, sometimes using, a billing code that is easier for the reimbursement rather than the true ICD-9 disease code. So you have a lot of challenges associated with parsing these clinical records, which again, we're going to talk about in a second. The second challenge is that these electronic health records are extremely sparse. Basically, if you say, for every one of these labs or, drugs or prescriptions or billing codes, how often are they found? They're basically not found at all for the vast majority of the patients, and they're found for a tiny, tiny subset at a time. So what you end up with is both noisy and sparse data sets. And moreover, you end up with multimodal data. Basically, the lab tests come from a very different distribution than the notes or the billing codes or the drugs, and so on and so forth. And the last subtlety, which many, many people unfortunately ignore, is that the data is not missing at random. And that's abbreviated as NMAR. So MAR is missing at random, NMAR is non-missing at random. And the reason is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lab test is prescribed when you expect the results to be abnormal. So that basically means that if you look at the results of patients and you see how many of those results are abnormally high, how many of those results are abnormally low, and what is the actual distribution, what you see is that the data is distributed much more extremely than what you would expect from any kind of biological variable. Okay? So that means that you have to make inferences about missing data in a very different way than if the data was actually missing at random. And then this is something where, you know, similarly, if you look at ratings on the internet, like somebody goes to a restaurant and he's kind of, you know, okay, they're not going to write a review. If it's amazing, they'll write a review. And if it's horrible, they'll write a review. But if it's, you know, good, they probably won't, you know, write a review. So Yahoo and others have basically been using this systematically to sort of get a much more realistic, reflective measure of the true quality, if you wish, of anything that's being rated using this, you know, this non-missing at random model. So the key idea here is that you want to explicitly measure, model the missing mechanism, the mechanism of missingness. You basically can say if something is missing completely at random, or if something is missing at random, or something is non-missing at random, then how is the data actually sampled? Basically, there's a model parameter, which basically says, you know, do I expect the missingness variable to basically be instantiated or not, based on the cluster that the patient actually belongs in. So based on the other information on my patient record, I can infer what cluster the patient already belongs in. And that can basically have an inference on the missing variable itself. Everybody with me here? So by explicitly modeling this missing variable, you can basically be much more accurate about your overall prediction. Okay? So you can basically code that missing indicator as part of the data itself. You could basically say, hey, this value is actually missing, and so on and so forth. So by actually using the missing information, you can dramatically improve the medical predictions, and you can basically jointly model both the lab test assignment and the lab test result. Basically, whether there was a decision to measure something based on explicitly modeling this missing mechanism. Everybody with me here? Yeah. Correct. The key idea is that you want to predict the missingness itself. You want to model the missingness, and to basically say, by the fact that the variable was measured, I'm learning something about that variable in the system. And by observing its value, I'm learning something additional about that variable in the system. Yeah, I see what you mean. So basically what you're saying is that the value will never be observed unless the missingness is, you know, zero. Yeah. So the reason why I'm describing them separately is that I can deal with imputed values as well. I can basically say, I can use the value of a variable, even if it hasn't been explicitly measured. And therefore, in my overall model, I don't want to only deal with the conditional probability only if missingness was not there. Basically, that the explicit modeling of the missingness allows me to now integrate over the latent distribution of the missing variable in addition to the missingness value itself. Yeah, I would say two independent variables or two partly dependent variables, basically each of which is influencing the latent probability inferred for the state of the patient, but in different ways. Okay. Any other questions? Awesome. So again, you can jointly model the missing indicators and the lab test. You can basically say, what is the patient score for a given topic? What is the likelihood for a particular question? And what is the missing indicator likelihood? And you can kind of, you know, input that explicitly in some patient topic modeling, where you're basically saying what subgroup of patients is that patient sampled from. So you have some observed frequency, you have some patient lab latent variable, you have some hyperparameters, and then you have the test result and the observation of the test. Okay. So using this, you can basically now start inferring information about the patients, and you can now start also inferring information jointly across multimodal information. So the patient state depends not just on the clinical note, not just on the prescriptions, not just on the questionnaire, but on all of the above, okay? So now you can start modeling this mixture of EHR records by basically modeling the patient gene, patient lab, patient ICD code, patient questionnaire, etc., each of which is now contributing to your overall representation of a patient. And that allows you to now start modeling disease topics for every patient that are multimodal. So, for example, the topic of cirrhosis or a pulmonary embolism or HIV or diabetes or leukemia or dementia or psychiatric conditions is basically modeled using a combination of features across different types of variables. And then, for example, these variables can be the DRG code, the ICD-9 code, the prescription, and so on and so forth. And these are now combined with each other instead of just living in different spectra. And that allows you to now prioritize patients based on the disease mixture. You can basically find groups of patients that are high risk based on the cluster that they're in, which is itself informed by all kinds of additional variables across the clinical record. You can also start using it for imputation. So very often when the patient goes to the doctor, they just check one ICD-9 code for billing. But they're leaving a lot of stuff blank, even though it would apply to that patient because they don't have time to go and check every single variable. But we can basically now go in and start imputing those missing variables. And we can also start predicting future events. For example, you can look at past patient visits and start predicting future patient outcomes using that information. Is everybody with me here? So that's basically starting to deal with these population-scale EHRs with these multiple phenotypes together. And you can now start incorporating genetic information as well into this mixture. So up until now, I've been talking to you about patient records, but you can now start thinking about these multi-phenotype aspects in the context of genetic information as well. You could basically say, what is the polygenic risk for schizophrenia and bipolar jointly? What is the multi-phenotype association across multiple different phenotypes? So basically for every phenotype, I can start adding a diamond, and then I can start saying, well, there's some regions that are associated with multiple phenotypes jointly. And you can now start flipping this around. Instead of saying which genetic variants are associated with my trait of interest, you can say, for a given genetic variant, what are all of the traits that are associated with that locus or with that variant? So you can now start saying, instead of just doing a genome-wide association study for schizophrenia, I'm going to do a phenome-wide association study for IRF4 or for TERT or for, CDKN2BAS and so on and so forth, okay? And what I'm learning is that specific variants are associated with combinations of conditions. Sometimes a variant is associated with multiple cardiovascular traits. Sometimes a variant is associated with a single dermatological and a single digestive trait. Sometimes a variant is associated with, many, many traits. And this is particularly true of the HLA locus, the major histocompatibility locus, which is associated with, for example, type 1 diabetes, with conjunctivitis and infections, rheumatoid arthritis, viral pneumonia, etc. So a lot of immune traits will basically end up, coming up over and over again. Is everybody with me here about PheWAS? And sort of this, ability to now start thinking about combinations of traits to, to start understanding the roles of pleiotropy of some of those variants that can be, associated with many, many different phenotypes, okay? So you can now leverage that in the context of genome-wide association study and basically gain a lot of power by modeling these multiple phenotypes together. And you can correct for these genetic correlations across these multiple phenotypes based on the linkage disequilibrium patterns and then the relationships between different genes. And that allows you to now start building matrices of which traits tend to be co-associated based on their global heritability. For example, you see that height and infant head circumference and birth length and birth weight are in fact very strongly correlated with each other. You see that Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, age of menarche and HDL, you see that rheumatoid arthritis is, quite distinct on its own, and so is Alzheimer's. But triglycerides, LDL, and coronary artery disease are in fact highly correlated, and so on and so forth. Everybody with me here? So that's now bringing genetic information to understand these correlations and these shared genetic influences. And then we talked about causality, and I think this ability to now start saying, if I correct for one, is there still an association for the other? So basically, if you now, correct for a particular variable, if I correct for BMI or if I correct for triglycerides, then what is the residual genetic effect? And what you can see is that you can infer that BMI is a causal factor of triglycerides, but not the other way around, based on this correction for BMI that, ends up obviating the, the effect of genetics on triglycerides. And then similarly, you can see that LDL cholesterol is in fact highly predictive of coronary artery disease, but not the other way around. So basically, if you do the inverse correction, you basically see that the, correlation goes away. Everybody with me here? Awesome. So you can do this to basically note, for example, that type 2 diabetes is caused by BMI, but not the other way around. And, specific measurements are, predictive of other measurements. Okay. So all of this is based on now genetic influences and electronic health record and measurements and these types of observations that are biased by the state inferred for the patient. We can now start also now talking about biomarkers in the context of the clinical records. And in particular, as I mentioned earlier, a biomarker by itself is very often predictive of the patient outcome. Why? Because if there's an underlying risk that predicts the phenotype and also predicts the biomarker, so basically you can have this double prediction of the underlying risk, then when you observe the biomarker, you can say, well, that basically means that my underlying risk is high, and therefore that the patient outcome is going to be worse. Is everybody with me with the red arrows here at the top? But the problem is that when the biomarker is actually very predictive of the patient outcome, this is actually used by the doctors to provide better outcomes. And therefore, the treatment will be based on the biomarker. And the treatment itself will now predict a better patient outcome. Is everybody with me here? So now if you look at the correlation between, say, a risk variable such as creatinine, which is basically an indicator of renal failure, and therefore we expect the mortality risk to increase with creatinine. And it could increase monotonically, either linearly or in some kind of curve, but you expect that the more creatinine in the blood, the higher the odds of mortality. Can I get a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 as to who's following me here? Awesome. So basically, I would expect normally to have some kind of monotonic relationship. But instead, here's what I find. When we look at the relationship in the medical record of thousands of individuals across creatinine and mortality, what you see is that the risk of mortality indeed increases monotonically until you hit the very round number of 3. And then it drops. And then it increases again monotonically until you hit the round number of 5. And then it drops again. So if you applied a naive AI algorithm, it would basically say, oh, wow, this is the better health outcome. So why don't I push the creatinine level of the patient to like this high, because these patients are clearly doing better. Everybody with me here? So basically in practice, the curve is much more complex, and there's very sharp thresholds, and these thresholds are based on the interventions, and they're also, associated with these very round numbers. So Ben and I wrote this paper called Death by Round Numbers and Sharp Thresholds. And the reason is that the doctors intervene in these cases, and sometimes they will actually make the wrong decision because you're just on one side or the other side of the threshold. Okay? So what can we do instead? What we can do is that we can basically say, listen, why don't we build an explainable model? And why don't we build an explainable model that is additive? where I can basically have these transparent, flexible glass box models, where one model basically says risk increases with creatinine, as I would expect. Another model says that at the intervention point of 3 milligrams per deciliter, then I will have a treatment intervention, and therefore the risk will decrease. And then at another threshold, I will have another intervention, and the risk will decrease again. Is everybody with me here? So now you can build this model and then actually model the response curve distribution across the electronic health record using these explainable AI models. And you can do this systematically and find a lot of new insights about the medical record. So Ben and I basically sat down and interpreted a lot of these insights manually. And then eventually, with the advent of ChatGPT 3 and ChatGPT 4, we basically said, okay, why don't we just use AI to automatically interpret these discontinuities in the electronic health record? So you can basically say, can we now describe the univariate graph as text so that the AI language models are able to reason about the text? And here it says the graph represents a continuous valued feature. The keys are intervals that represent ranges where the function predicts the same value, feature name age, feature type continuous, etc. Everybody with me here? So then the LLM basically says, okay, well, the general pattern of the graph indicates that as the age increases, the log odds contribution also increases, meaning that older age is associated with higher risk of death due to pneumonia. In the age range of about 18 to 67, the contribution to log odds negative, is negative, which predicts, etc. In the age range, it's important to know that the exact turning point where the risk increases can vary, as indicated by the lower and the upper bounds of each range, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we can basically now unleash these very transparent glass box additive models, feed them into an AI, and basically say, does the risk increase monotonically with age? Yes, according to the data, the risk of death, from pneumonia increases monotonically. Or what would the average risk of an 82-year-old patient be? What is the best trend line? Explain your answer in a linear equation in the forks of etc. Okay, so you can basically treat the system in a way that allows you to now start interpreting this. And then the model, in the end, will say, in summary, the model provides an intricate and nuanced prediction of the likelihood of death from pneumonia based on a wide range of patient features. However, given the complexity of the relationship and the uncertainty, the model output should be interpreted with caution. Okay? So basically, we built this talk to this electronic, glass box model that allows us to now start mining many of these features without having to go through every single one of them. And then the system can start flagging discontinuities and, unusual patterns and so on and so forth. Everybody with me here so far? So up until here, we've basically been using these variables and we've been dealing with structured data mostly. But I now want to turn to how do we now use this extraordinarily rich information that is encoded in sometimes the handwritten notes and more the dictated notes from the doctor. Okay, so what I'm going to turn to now is what are the tools for natural language processing specifically applied to electronic health records. Okay, everybody with me here? Awesome. So what do we want from natural language processing? We want to extract structured data from narrative text. For example, I want to automatically compute the billing codes from the notes, or infer codes of symptoms from a narrative, or understand the plans from the doctor's and the nurse's notes. I want to alternatively extract narrative text from the structured data. As I showed you in the previous example, we can basically translate a graph into a description of the features of that graph. And I can, generate reports from imaging data or from signals and so on and so forth. I can also combine text models with other data. For example, I want to select a cohort for my clinical trial, or I want to predict the outcome of a patient before I prescribe the drug, so I can decide what drug to prescribe. I can also summarize vast numbers of notes to the stuff that's the most important. And what most important is, of course, specific to a use case. I can also answer questions. I can basically have an AI session with all of the information from a patient, and I can ask questions about that patient. And the idea is that we want for every word or phrase to be explainable, to be transparent, to be accountable. I want to assign it a meaning or null from some taxonomy, some ontology, some terminology, so that I can then do computation on that. For example, I want to detect the words rheumatoid arthritis and instead assign a billing code that will be associated with that record. And then for any word or phrase, I want to determine whether it represents protected health information. For example, if I read Mr. Huntington suffers from Huntington's disease, I want to say, well, I want to hide the name, but I don't want to hide the name of the disease. Okay, so just the word Huntington being erased from everywhere in the record is not the right thing to do. Instead, what I want to understand is the context of every word in place to understand what is protected information. And I want to also determine aspects of every entity, such as the time, the location, the confidence with which I'm making an inference. And also, if I have identified two meaningful phrases in a sentence, I want to understand if there is a relationship between them. If one of them causes the other, or if the other one, if it precedes it, if it prevents it or treats it, or if it's indicative of. And we also want a taxonomy of these relationships between these words from each other. And then in a larger document, I want to identify sentences or fragments that are the most relevant to answer a specific medical question. So if I say, oh, I recommended this for the patient, I want to know why. I want to be able to sort of attribute that recommendation or that answer. Is the patient at risk? No, because of this and this and that information. Or is the patient at risk? Yes, because of this information, so on and so forth. So basically, where is the patient's exercise regimen discussed? I want to be able to summarize. So basically, as data sets become enormous, how do I provide a meaningful overview? And I want to be able to sort of model topics, as I mentioned earlier, basically what disease classes patients belong in, or create these representations that I showed you by being able to map information into the latent embeddings for these patients. So basically, I want to be able to model this vector space of patient trajectories. Is everybody with me here as to what our goals are? So again, if you have some text, if you basically have some information, you can use that to, just 1 second. Please join me in 32144. In the lobby. So for example, if I have this narrative for, Mr. Blind is a 50-year-old white male with a history of diabetes mellitus, inferior myocardial infarction, who underwent open repair of his increased diverticulum, November 13th, etc. What you want is to extract from this different types of information. You can extract demographic information. You can extract patient condition and disease. You can extract, procedures and, the results of the measurements and the time and so on and so forth. Okay. So what you want is to take a narrative and be able to categorize specific types of information. Everybody with me here? So you can basically do that with a lot of classical natural language processing. And the advantage of that is that sometimes it's much more traceable. You can kind of say, here's exactly why I made this particular prediction. And all of this modeling is in a way a precursor to the modern day large language models. So basically, there's been a very long-standing interest in grammar and syntax to understand semantics, basically being able to map the concept of no or, negation, for example, being able to model V and anterior or V and chest and how they modify, specific words in specific sentences and so on and so forth. So basically, the key concept that has been driving a lot of that is that the syntactic relationship between phrases is mapping to a semantic relationship between the corresponding meanings of these phrases. And that has been sort of this key assumption. And therefore, if I can translate every grammar rule to match a semantic function, I can basically understand what are the reference or the functions, what is the environment of relationships What is the meaning that I can extract from these? And I can use that to now spot specific terms. For example, if I am trying to put the code anosmia, then I should be able to sort of detect which aspect of the medical record is actually associated with loss of smell. And notice that loss of is actually a negating or loss of taste, and so on and so forth. So basically the question is, how do you deal with negation? And then, how do you deal with uncertainty? And there was a lot of work in being able to now understand when you have negation, when you have, all of the different ways that we can say the negative of something. Okay. And then these are, the number of phrases that are associated with negation is just exploding. No signs of, ruled out entirely, unlikely. Absence of, not demonstrated, denies, no evidence of, denied, without, doubt, versus, etc. Okay? So a lot of these things now have to be taken, explicitly. And then the other concept is the concept of synonyms. So can we take individual words and now expand them out into hierarchies of how these words are similar to each other? The way that this is done nowadays is through, of course, word2vec, the ability to project individual words into their embedding vectors, which, of course, we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. But this is sort of the precursor of a lot of that for understanding the relationships between these different words. And this is also marking the shift from these rule-based systems where you had to explicitly think about every possible condition, every possible misspelling, every possible way of phrasing something, to now simply letting loose the attention mechanism and the word2vec capabilities, and sort of use all of that to understand these relationships that have been previously hard-coded. Okay. The other extraordinarily challenging aspect of clinical records is abbreviations. So basically, doctors have very little time. They use acronyms all the time. And then, there's many different ways that you can abbreviate something, and there's many different meanings for the same abbreviation. What's really embarrassing is that if you look at 3-letter abbreviations, 81% of them were actually ambiguous. They, the mean number of senses was actually 17 different meanings for, every 3-letter acronym on average. So, if you ignore rare occurrences, then, still 65% were ambiguous with an average of 5 meanings for each of them. And, that is obviously an enormous challenge. You don't want to be misinterpreting an acronym and suddenly you have the wrong billing code. And that's where all of the modeling that I showed you earlier comes in. Basically, by being able to model multiple aspects of the medical record, you can say, well, now the clinical note is actually in disagreement with the other variables in the medical record, with the lab test, with the prescriptions, with the patient class. So maybe I want to flag this and then go back to the interpretation, or maybe have a unified model that will say, well, this interpretation was slightly more likely, but in the context of everything else I know about the patient, now this other interpretation that was just below in the probability has now become the most likely one. Is everybody with me here? Awesome. So again, there was a lot of machine learning work to identify the relations between different types of entities. So basically what modifies what. And, for example, the LASIX started yesterday, reduced ascites. And, what reduced? Well, it's ascites. The temporal relationship is when it was started yesterday, and so on and so forth. So, the such and such was administered to Mr. Huntington, or was considered for control, or was ineffective and therefore discontinued, etc. Okay. And then we talked about topic modeling earlier, where basically you can now think about documents as basically being sampling of words which are themselves sampled from topics which are associated with different word frequencies. And therefore, every time you read either an article in a newspaper or a patient record, you can basically start inferring the topics that are associated with that word. And that's where latent Dirichlet allocation, or LDA, comes in. Basically, the observations are words, but everything else is inferred. And then we have some kind of assumed structure. So we have some topic parameter, and then you're sampling topics using these parameters. And then given the topic that you've sampled, you're now sampling words. So you have some kind of per document topic proportion. This document might be associated with, I don't know, genes, DNA, and genetic, another document with brain, neurons, and nerves, etc. And now there's proportions associated with each of these topics. And therefore, you're sampling words according to the per word topic assignment for every word. And then, the proportions parameter. So basically, you have a set of topics. You have a set of proportions for every document. And these are your parameters. And then for every observed word, you're assigning it to a topic. And that gives you an increased frequency of the topic within the document, and so on and so forth. Everybody with me here? All right. So that's sort of where the transition to language models starts to happen. So basically, you can now start statistically modeling frequencies of individual words. So if you don't have any information and you are asked to predict the next word, what next word would you choose? The. Or, the next one is off, and, to, etc. And basically those words have this, geometric distribution, this exponential drop off where, a small number of words are the most highly ranked. So the top 10 ranked words make up 23% of the corpus. And that's modeling one word at a time, but you can model n-grams. You can basically say, if I have all of Shakespeare as a corpus, I have, 800,000 tokens. I have, a vocabulary of 29,000 words. Shakespeare produced 300,000 bigrams, like combinations of two words, out of all possible 844 million bigrams. So that's, of course, a tiny, tiny subset because, he's not putting words at random next to each other. So you can now start asking, what is the frequency of 4-letter words if I start with, say, ceramics? Or if I start of serve as the, incoming or incubator or independent or index, etc. So you can basically model or all 3 grams or all 4 grams in sort of the entire corpus of, say, the Library of Congress or all of Shakespeare or every medical record or all of PubMed and so on and so forth. And you can now start saying, okay, can I use this to generate one word at a time? Or to generate 4 words at a time, or 8 words at a time. And basically the context, as it increases, you basically get closer and closer to something meaningful. So if you try to generate Shakespeare with 1 word at a time, then, there's some words Shakespearean-like words, but like this makes no sense whatsoever. And with 2, it's slightly better. With 3, it's slightly better. And with 4, it's already surprisingly good. I will go seek the traitor Gloucester, exunt some of the watch, a great banquet served them, etc. Okay, so again, it's not Shakespeare, but it's, getting closer. And that's just asking about 4-word frequencies. And the concept of context is basically what led to this modern revolution of word-to-vec, large language models, etc. And what is that revolution? That revolution is that understanding how to predict the next word based on context allows me to now say that this word and that word have similar contexts. And therefore, I can encode their latent representation in similar vectors. Okay? So this is basically, taking all these ideas and now sort of taking them to modern day natural language processing. So basically, the key idea is that we can use arbitrarily complex models as long as they're differentiable, and we can do gradient descent and train them. And they can be trained by stochastic gradient descent. So gradient descent basically requires going through all of your training data at every iteration of every slightest parameter. And stochastic gradient descent basically says, well, as long as I'm sampling some words every now and then, I can kind of tune the entire vector, in the same way. Just 1 second. So the key idea is that I can train a machine learning model to predict the missing word, and I can predict the next token, or I can predict a masked token in the middle by asking, this Markovian assumption that basically says that I don't have any additional history about anything else except for the words that I give it, in that context. And this idea is, can we now understand the relationship between words using this type of function? And this is the basis for word2vec. The basis is that the words, president, leader, minister, chairman, director, spokesman, etc., are kind of interchangeable, or at least they appear in similar contexts, and therefore they will be mapped to similar vectors in that latent space. And what's really interesting is that this even worked with numbers. Like, for example, 1 sits up there in isolation, then 20, 15, 10, 30 are kind of sitting there. And why is 16 and 11 and 13 not there? Because they're a different type of speech. Basically, this is approximate speech, and maybe 11 and 13.7 are a very different type of speech that doesn't arise in the same sentences. And then in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, several appear, together, and few, and so on and so forth. And again, as you heard in the previous lecture, the classic example is that perhaps the relationship between queens and queen is one of making it plural. And that's a vector in this very high dimensional space that basically points towards plurality, if you wish. And if I apply that vector to the word king, or at least to the vector representation of the word king, then I will be able to transform the word king into the word kings, or at least that the corresponding locations will be collinear with each other, okay? In the same way, I can take the vector between, aunt and uncle and add it to the word king and get queen, and so on and so forth, okay? Again, this doesn't work exactly that way because there's a lot of additional connotations associated with, the difference between aunt and uncle or queen and king and so on and so forth are not exactly completely collinear, but at least it gives you an idea for how this space works. Is everybody with me here? So that's now for individual words in isolation. I can do the same thing for words in the context of other words. So I can basically now take each of these words and now create an embedding representation of these words. And I can do that based on either the number of letters. I can use as tokens individual words or individual letters or individual phonemes or combinations of letters and so on and so forth. And I can basically start adding this information and basically constructing this clustering of numbers in this way. And then we can now encode using the embedding and the representation learning and decode to basically make the actual prediction. I can train the weights through this very densely connected network in the latent representation space, and then through the embeddings with backpropagation. And again, what I'm starting with is initial embeddings that are scattered. But as I start training the model and trying to predict the next word better and better and better, the embeddings are basically creating representations that are much more interpretable. And I can basically go from characters to words and then, build this larger context, okay? So again, for tokenization, I can use word level tokenization. I can use character-based tokenization, but by far the most powerful is basically using subwords. And the concept is that even as we're learning the English language, we're understanding roots and contexts and tokens that are sort of smaller than a word, but larger than a character. And that's sort of the sweet spot of resolution, okay? So now that you have these tokens, you can now start predicting, based on context. And then this idea of using this memory, both forward and backward in my prediction is very powerful. So basically, I can use these contextual embeddings from language to start, predicting these words. And I can use this bidirectional long short-term memory module to basically go back and forth, both forward in the sentence and reverse in the sentence. I can use that also for de-identification of medical records. So I can basically go and identify which of these words are actual identifiers of, personal data. And then again, we spoke a lot about this transformer model. The concept of the transformer model is that you have this explicit positional embedding that basically allows you to now start representing words in the context of other words in that sentence. Jean-Claude? So you can now use the self-attention You can basically use this. We talked again about self-attention and also cross-attention. So cross-attention basically tells you, say, between English and French, what is the right word that I should be using to do the translation? Or between text and image, what is the right part of the image that corresponds to a particular word in that translation? So that's cross-attention. Now, self-attention is within the same sentence. What are the words that are related to each other in that sentence? And I think the magic of modern machine learning lies very much in this attention mechanism, in this ability to think about human language as constantly self-transforming, if you wish. And you could basically think about, the word, I don't know, Apple, in the context of a hardware store or a computer hardware store. Apple has a very different meaning than in the context of a farm. And all of that reweighing, all of that transformation from the original vectors to some new location of those vectors basically happens through this query key value mechanism that allows you to now, for every word, understand what is the relationship between that word and every other word. And that gives you this relationship matrix, which is basically the query times the key. And you apply that relationship matrix to the values of the original words to basically get this transformed meaning of every word that is now sitting in the context of all of the other words in the sentence. So basically, your keys are the words themselves. Your query is every individual word. That gives you the normalization vector, which is basically the query times the key. And what is that applied to? The words themselves, which are now getting transformed into this new space where now the latent embedding of every word has been transformed based on the context of all of the other words in the sentence. Is everybody with me here? Awesome. And again, you can do this multiple times. You don't have to understand just a single context, but you can now understand this network of relationships multiple times. And you can use this masking approach that basically makes sure that you don't sort of predict from future words in the sentence. And you can apply that at training, at inference, and so on and so forth. Okay. So that allows you to now start interpreting text in a much richer way, and clustering these embeddings. And again, this has been extraordinarily impactful. You've probably read dozens of articles about sort of LLMs and ChatGPT, and in that context. But I want to sort of add one more concept here, which is that these generative pre-trained transformer models, GPT-2, GPT-3, were based on specifically that transformer architecture. But the moment you get to GPT-4, you add an additional complexity. And that additional complexity is the concept of an agent. And the concept of an agent relies on the concept of reinforcement learning, okay? So what does that mean? That means that I now have a large language model and I can understand human text, but I need to also understand intention. I need to understand, goals and, vision, etc. And you can now use these large language models and train them further to basically become agents for the human that's using them, okay? The idea is that I'm no longer modeling observational information in machine learning. Now the machine learning system becomes an agent acting in an environment and getting rewards from that environment. So an agent basically makes an action into the environment. That action changes the state of the agent. And then there's a reward that comes to the agent from the impact of that action in the environment. Is everybody with me here? So that's the key concept of reinforcement learning. And that has been extraordinarily powerful in sort of playing games, being able to understand what is the action that I should be doing? What is the next best action in the context of a robot, in the context of a game, in the context of Go, and so on and so forth. And that has just beat humans completely out of the competition for all of these very well constrained games. And now that's where reinforcement learning is so exciting, because in the context of electronic health records and in the context of patient recommendations, these agents now become, these sort of meaningful systems that are able to learn these policies. What is a policy? A policy is a set of decisions that I will make based on the environment, actions that I will take that will maximize my eventual maximal reward. And many of these actions I don't get immediate rewards for. So there's this delayed gratification that is associated with reinforcement learning. Okay. So as a cherry on top of the lecture today, I invited our collaborator and friend, Jean-Claude Sarbini, to basically tell you about how this concept of agents and this concept of reinforcement learning and this concept of AI and LLMs is actually used in practice in the context of value-based healthcare. And unfortunately, we only have a few minutes.
Yeah.
But 5 minutes, 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hey, good afternoon. I'm going to go quickly through some of these slides. Just background in healthcare. I was here at some point. The problem we're going after is a big problem. There aren't that many $5 trillion problems in the world. This is a $5 trillion problem. In the United States, we use 50% of the global worldwide spend on healthcare on 4% of the population, right? So clearly there are inefficiencies. We do not need to spend that much. And the other thing we're heading on, and that's why we need AI agents in the space, is that we have a shortage of physicians. We're coming to short of 40,000 physicians by the end of the decade. So we can't hire or train enough primary care physicians. So what we need to do is use technology to wrap around the physician. We're not going to replace them, but use technology around them. Another big thing in healthcare, which is kind of weird, is that misaligned incentives. So the customer is not the consumer. So the consumer is healthcare as a patient, but they're not the customer because you don't pay for anything related to healthcare, right? So you just consume resources. Second thing is that it's a perverse incentive, which is providers purchase their own services, right? So health systems sort of can buy their own services. They recommend to you to do something, which is a service that they provide to you, which is kind of a weird thing. So then the intent here is there is a model that actually works in healthcare to fix healthcare, which is called value-based care, which is you change the incentives to start paying for outcomes and overall health of populations as opposed to paying for services rendered, right? Rather than the payments be for x-rays or visits or whatever, the payments are around how healthy are you as a diabetic patient. If you get healthier, money gets made. If you don't get healthier, whoever is responsible for you doesn't make money. So the incentive is around making you better as a patient as opposed to giving you services. So if we buy into this concept, right, that value-based care is a model that will advance healthcare to a better place, and we buy into a whole bunch of challenges in healthcare, which I cannot get into. We have this framework that says to manage in value-based care, you need to be able to manage preventive conditions, manage chronic conditions that patients have, manage high-risk patients, orchestrate patients as they go in and out of care, into hospitals, out of the hospital, in the hospital, out of the hospital, and as they travel the network. And under these 5 domains are hundreds of services that need to be orchestrated. And with the shortage that we have of physicians, in order to do that, that can only be done with AI. However, as we think about AI, I can ignore what every publication out there is saying, AI, doctor in a box, and AI. That's not what it's about. Actually, there are many agents that can be deployed in healthcare that have nothing to do with replacing doctors. It's actually more mundane things than that add more value. So here I present a framework for AI to transform primary care services. First and foremost, it's at the data layer, right? You're bringing billions and billions of data records between payers, insurance companies, health systems, consumer data. And to make sense of that data, you need AI agents that can understand lab results. So if I write 24-hour creatinine test or creat 24 or 24H creat or misspelled thousands of ways calling that one has an actual long code, and I can make sense that that's one test that was rendered to that patient. So that's the bottom layer, right? So agents that can make sense of data. Next layer is agents that can detect and predict medical conditions. So the data that's there is not telling us what's up, what's wrong with the patient. So models that can say, oh, with all of that data, I now know that you are diabetic, although you're not coded for diabetic, because I saw all of these signals that tell me you're diabetic or you have hypertension, or I can predict your trajectory. This is where you are heading, right? You are heading to becoming diabetic with that probability. So there are agents that are about detection and prediction that use all of the data available on you, structured and unstructured data. Agents that sit in the workflow of the physician that advise the physician what to do. Physicians have, you know how many minutes physician has to talk to a patient? Yeah. And now some of you, y'all young folks, you show up and you're like, okay, I talked to them 12 minutes and I leave. A patient with like 12 comorbidities, they have congestive heart failure, COPD, diabetes, hypertension, amputation, and 2 other things that are coming up that just got discharged, needs 2 hours to talk to their physician. That time is not available. So that's where AI becomes an agent that assists the physician in what to focus on and tells the physician what not to focus on, that AI can take care of. That's at the point of care. And then certainly AI to engage with populations. Studies were done where a primary care physician with 2,500 patients in their panel, that's usually what they have in their panel, needs, if they follow all of the guidelines given by medicine, proper guidelines, they need 26.7 hours a day to take care of their population, which they don't have. They have 8 hours of work day. Maybe they're working 10 hours, but 5 days a week. So it's impossible for a physician to take care of a patient population. And that's where you have this deployment of agents that are acting on behalf of primary care physicians that are engaging with patients, counseling them on genetic testing, counseling them on vaccination, checking if they did vaccination, scheduling them to do a screening, and so on. So we look at the world as a series of, and there's a patient that, these agents would act on, but a series of agents that are deployed against healthcare that start with the most difficult, yet most we don't look at in mundane, which is mixing data, extracting insights, acting at point of care when the physician is present, and then at scale, acting at a population that physicians are not able to reach. That's. Yeah, so look, I don't have it functioning as I should have brought the demo, but I wasn't ready. But I'll show you some examples here, right? So this is one of them, right? Which is you can map a whole bunch of things to LOINC. There are thousands of codes and thousands of medications and thousands of concepts that need to be mapped. And we're ingesting something like, I think now it's like 80 billion clinical facts. And you can't have humans make sense of 80 billion clinical facts. So this is where AI plays a big role. AI, again, on predicting the risk of hospitalization, risk of readmission, prospective cost. How much are you going to cost as a patient in the future, right? People care about that. Risk of medication non-adherence. Not only that, why are you going to be medication non-adherent? Is it a language barrier? You literally did not understand that your primary care physician said that you take this for 2 months and then you go and get a refill? Or do you not have transportation? Or do you not care? Or is giving you a stomach ache? And that's why you stop taking medication. So understanding, so these AI models are extremely powerful at detecting all of these sort of signals and then engaging with patients with things that are contextual to patients. You have things like, again, at point of care, your real line. Look at that, not bad. So we have these agents again that sit at point of care, the ambient listening. They're now understanding who's saying what in the room, what are the relevant facts, what facts are used for documentation versus what facts are used for detection of medical conditions, what facts are used to provide advice to the physician. summarization of what's happening, and also doing differential diagnosis, like listening into the signals and then trying to figure out through process of elimination what is the medical condition of that patient as they give me all of these symptoms that are happening to them. And then finally, and this is like actually I can maybe do a demo, but if finally this is where I think the holy grail of this is, which is using AI to do multimodal scaled outreach to patients and get them to engage with their health system in a way that humans can never do, right? There are only so many phone calls that somebody could do from a physician practice to patients to tell them, hey, you didn't show up yesterday, why not? Let me figure out, right? You could do 5 calls, 10 calls a day. You can do unlimited number of outreaches, not all phone calls, through a variety of modalities. And one thing I would add is that we believe, I certainly believe that if patients sort of totality of healthcare state goes way beyond their clinical facts. We're consumers and humans before we become patients. And as we look at data to activate all of these, we also should be, and we use consumer type data to enrich clinical data and understand who you are as a person and how to best engage with you as a person, including your clinical facts, but in mechanisms that go beyond your clinical facts.
Okay. So the reason why I'm so happy to have Jean-Claude with us is because we can talk about AI in healthcare ad nauseum, but how is that change going to happen? Is that going to happen from the physicians? Is that going to happen from the hospitals? Is it going to happen from the healthcare systems? Is it going to happen from the insurance companies? And I think that value-based care, the first time I learned about it just blew my mind in terms of, wow, you can actually align the incentives. The moment you take on the life of a patient, you can basically suddenly want the actual best health outcomes. And I don't know if you guys want to see a demo, but basically do you want to call your system?
That's fine.
So basically they have this extraordinary system where he's actually able to just call in and then, I'm an AI assistant, may I speak with Roy? Yeah, that's Roy, etc. Yeah, let's do it, etc. So basically what you see is happening here is that the same interaction that you would have with the physician assistant or with sometimes the physician themselves, you can now have with this extraordinarily capable system that is able to sort of deal with these real world scenarios and circumstances. So I was truly blown away when I saw the demo and sort of, it's just so exciting to see this just directly being applied to the real world. So as an academic, needless to say, I'm so super excited. So what have we learned about today? We basically learned about how to go from individual traits to many traits, from a single disease to all of these different variables, how we can basically flip around genome-wide association studies and start thinking about multiple phenotypes associated with one variant, how we can actually model clinical records as a mixture of latent Dirichlet allocation models and patients being sampled from these mixtures, how we can actually model these interventions and these reverse causality that happens when your biomarker itself is used as a decision for treatment, and how this can in fact influence the probability of mortality when you're dealing with these systems. We then saw the progression of these natural language processing systems from just modeling individual words, understanding simple relationship, to now being able to model with billions of parameters this extraordinarily rich context, and how we can now go beyond just language and modeling to actual agents and interventions, and then taking these steps through reinforcement learning. And then lastly, how these are actually applied to the real world. So next time we're switching to molecular evolution, and then the last 2 lectures are going to be on modeling metabolism. So looking forward to seeing you guys on Thursday, and then for your projects on Friday. That's where I'll stop, and thank you all.